No, I already ruined it. Welcome to the fine print, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey, coming at you with a Halloween interview today. I'm still learning how to use StreamYard, so please bear with me. And I'm not going to waste a lot of time. I do want to do a couple of shout outs here to my previous guests, Diana Stewart from River Ridge Cannabis, Josh Schweider from Infinite Chemical Analysis Labs in California, and Carly Bader from Willow Industries doing the ozone remediation out in Colorado. Also, Anton Mordican, Native Black Cultivation down in Alabama. That was a great interview too. We're on a kind of a tight schedule today, so I want to keep this tight. I'm really happy. My guest today is from New York Cannabis Insider. In my opinion, has done some of the best coverage here of the cannabis industry on the East Coast that I've seen. You can yell at me later if I'm wrong, but let's unsolo me. And there we go. It's Brad Racino, New York Cannabis Insider. Brad, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for having me. And I've got a special guest co-host here. It's Lou Rinaldi. You might remember Lou from a couple of my previous interviews. Lou, thank you also for being here, man. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for having me, and it's good to see you both.
Brad, before we do anything serious, would you mind giving us a 5-minute life story?
Wow. 5 minutes. Okay. So, yeah, I grew up in New York in Orange County. Ended up kind of traveling quite a bit after high school, bounced around a bunch of different industries. I went from selling vacuums to opening up an art gallery to selling life insurance to moving to the Bahamas where I was an underwater. I was a shark videographer. I came back. I managed a New York branch of a photography company. Then I went to TV and I was a videographer and an editor and a producer. And then like when I was getting close to 30, I decided I wanted to be an investigative reporter. And I went to grad school out in Missouri. I got my master's. And then I moved to San Diego because why wouldn't you move to San Diego? It's ridiculous. It's beautiful and the food's amazing. So I moved out there for an internship, and then I started doing investigative reporting, and I kind of never looked back. I got a full-time job there at a small nonprofit newsroom that specialized just in investigative reporting and data, and was there for 9 years, helped build up the newsroom. I think when I was there, I was like one of 3 people. When I left, we had 17 or 18 staff members, and came back to New York because my wife and I had a little boy at the time, and then we also had our second on the way. We're both from New York. Grandparents were giving us the guilt trip like crazy for the last 9 years out in California. So finally moved back. My wife's from Central New York, and she had a good job opportunity, so we moved up here. And then I was kind of looking around for what to do in journalism up here, and it was tough because there was like nothing when it came to what I used to do in California. Everything's kind of concentrated in New York City, and we're like 6 hours away from the city. But then I just ended up having a talk with a news director here at Syracuse, just talking journalism. And he said, "Hey, I got this, we got this opportunity to start up this thing that we're thinking New York Cannabis Insider. Would you want to do it?" And I said, I've reported on every single thing you could possibly think of over the last 15 years or so, except cannabis. Like I had been in California, and cannabis was like, it was legal. It was so ubiquitous. I just never really saw it. I just didn't see it like I see it now, like as an actual industry with all these people and employees and government functions. Like I didn't see it. So when I came back, I said, sure, I'll give it a shot. And I spent several months just kind of learning the ropes, talking to as many experts as I could, reading the MRTA, talking to a lot of attorneys, getting the scoop, and then following it from the beginning, from when the Cannabis Control Board was first established and when they had their first meeting. And I think that first week we had an interview with Tremaine Wright, the chair of the Cannabis Control Board, and Chris Alexander from the Office of Cannabis Management. Haven't talked to them since. They haven't really wanted to talk to me much. But yeah, we kind of hit the ground running. I got my full-time reporter, Sean Tian. We hired him in December of 2021. And we kicked the publication off in earnest in March of 2022. So we've been up and running for more than a year and a half now. I think we've published like 600 or 700 stories to try and keep a lot of focus on accountability. I mean, it's my bread and butter. I love it. I love holding powerful people accountable and keeping people to their promises and looking out for the little guy. And that was kind of our mission statement from the beginning, was accountability, and then, uplifting kind of underserved, underrepresented voices and making sure that they're heard and they have a seat at the table. And so far so good. It has not been hard to find stories because, as you know, as both of you probably know, there's not a lot of journalism when it comes to cannabis, not just in New York, just anywhere in the country. I think in the next 10 years, you'll see it. You'll see a lot more of it and a lot more papers taking it seriously. New York Times hired their first cannabis reporter last year, Ashley. But it's been a whirlwind. It's been kind of like drinking from a fire hose with the amount of information coming out and trying to digest it and trying to decide like what we cover and what we don't. So we, one of the things we don't do is I don't cover the stuff that I know everyone else is going to cover. If there's a dispensary opening, if there is some PR thing, like I know other news stations, whatever, going to cover that. We don't do that. I try and reserve our limited resources for the stuff that I think really matters and that taxpayers and the public and people in this industry need to know. So I hope that was 5 minutes. I think that was about it.
You fucking nailed it, dude. That was great. Almost exactly 5 minutes. And I did want to ask you about Sean Tian, but you beat me to the punch on that segue. Perhaps because I've noticed, I've read a lot of you guys' stories, and in my personal opinion, it's some of the best coverage of the cannabis industry that I've seen in the 2 years that I've been looking at this. So thank you guys for that. I think you guys are doing great work. Would you tell us a little bit about Advanced Media and New York Cannabis Insider? And it sounds like Syracuse.com and New York Upstate. Would you mind telling us a little bit about those publications before we get into some shit?
Yeah, so it took me a while to kind of figure out the whole structure once I got here, and I think I understand it now. But Advanced Media is a large company that has a bunch of different news organizations, mainly in the Northeast. Like they have Mass Live, NJ.com, something in Pennsylvania. I'm forgetting the name of it. Blanking. They have something in Ohio. They have like, I think 12 or 13 different news organizations. They just started up one in Texas. So they do like a lot of local kind of news coverage, but they're also multi-pronged. Like they have a production arm. Their parent company is involved with like Condé Nast and I think Reddit. I think they might own Reddit. It's confusing, but they're a big company. This is kind of like a subset of a subset of a subset of it. And so New York Cannabis Insider is a vertical under Advanced Media, and we publish out of Syracuse.com and NewYorkUpstate.com, which are two entities that are owned by Advance. In the same way that actually 5 years ago, Advance started New Jersey Cannabis Insider, and they publish out of NJ.com. So they had kind of a template to go off of with New York. They saw the success in New Jersey over the last several years, and they said, well, New York is, they signed the law. It's going to be the same thing. Let's start something up here similar. And then we kind of took a different path than NJ did when it came to the coverage and stuff. They're super B2B, and they talk a lot about, industry trade shows or like things that are going on. Whereas that's because they're more established, that the market there is a little bit more established and up and running. But here it was a different path. So that's kind of the best way I can simplify it and explain it. I know it's confusing, but it's a subset.
No, that's great. And thank you. And, it sounds like we have sort of a tight schedule today. I want to keep it tight. And Lou hit me up with a great question earlier. I'm gonna throw him on here as Lou Rinaldi. Lou, you had a great question that I was really wondering where we were going to start this interview, because there's a lot to unpack in New York. It just seems like a shit show, and I didn't know where to start. And I thought Lou had a great question. Lou, take it away. Wait. Oh, I got to take that Brad banner down. There we go. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I'll start by saying that, Brad, I really appreciate the approach that you outlined. I'll also give a shout out to Sean Tian. I had the good fortune to interview him on a different podcast a while back, and that was a fantastic experience. I've been following along as well. There is actually plenty of journalism around cannabis, but it's all PR, it's all, parroting, press releases and stuff like that, like you said, and we don't need that. We need the work that you and Sean are doing. So thank you for that. Along those lines, and in terms of sort of level setting for the audience here, we've got to, my understanding is that Caleb's audience is kind of from all over. And we, the three of us are probably so close to the ground with a lot of this stuff that sometimes we forget how obtuse and informationally dense it can be. So I was hoping that you could kind of give us a lay of the land in terms of a lot of these acronyms that folks might have heard us throwing around, OCM, DASNY, CARD, things like that, just to get a sense of who the players are in the market and what are sort of the friction points, the points of contention, and the objectives that they're each trying to strive for, and how they kind of bump up against each other in some cases. So just to kind of get a sense of, what are the pieces on the chessboard in terms of the New York market, if you can give us just a flyover of that to kind of set the stage for the discussion.
That's a good question. Okay.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Lou. Yeah.
I'll try and take it kind of chronologically to make it make sense. So the first acronym is the MRTA. You hear people call it MRTA. That is the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. That's the law in New York State that legalized adult use cannabis in 2021. It was signed by Governor Andrew Cuomo, March 31st, 2021. That law is, almost a couple hundred pages long, and it sets up basically the regulatory, the framework for the entire industry in New York. It sets up the agencies that are going to be responsible for things, what they're responsible for, the tax structure, what's going to happen when people buy cannabis, where does that money go? A lot of the MRTA was heavily focused on social equity. So you see the definition of who kind of qualifies as social equity under the cannabis law. So this is a really dense, important document. So that was signed in March. Then nothing happened in New York State for 6 months. Cuomo just he didn't like weed. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. He was kind of forced to sign this thing, and they just let it languish. We all know what happened with Cuomo. He leaves. Governor Kathy Hochul comes in, and in her first week, one of her steps is to implement the major parts of the MRTA, which is setting up the OCM and the CCB. OCM is the Office of Cannabis Management. They are the government body that is responsible for crafting the rules and the regulations, the day-to-day, everything in New York State. The CCB is the Cannabis Control Board. That is basically the OCM's boss. It's a 5-member board these were all people who were appointed by either the governor or leaders in the state legislature. And their responsibility is to basically approve the laws that OCM creates, the regulations that OCM creates, and also approve the licenses that OCM has and will eventually issue. So OCM can say, we want to license these 200 people. That's great, but the CCB needs to approve those licenses. So the CCB and OCM are basically the two of the 4 main pillars in New York State cannabis. The other is the governor's office. A lot of people don't talk about the governor's office and her role in a lot of these things, but Governor Hochul's office has a lot of say in what happens in New York State, whether it's increasing budgets or yielding more enforcement power to certain agencies or signing laws that would benefit the industry. She has a lot of say in that. And then the fourth component is the one that people don't talk about the most, and it's my favorite, which is DASNY. And DASNY is the Dormitory Authority of the State of New York. They're a very opaque, obscure government agency that's been around for a very long time. They were.
Can you tell us exactly? Sorry to cut you off, but I wish you would tell us exactly what their function is and how they're connected to the cannabis industry as well.
Please. Yeah. So DASNY was set up, I think, in the 40s just to build dormitories around New York State. And then they kind of metastasized and they became bigger and bigger. And then they started building hospitals and they just kept building and building. And today they are, I think, the largest issuer of municipal bonds in the country. They issue billions of dollars in bonds. They have like 1,000 construction projects a year. They're a huge agency, but nobody really understands how they work. But because of their involvement with building, they were tapped and tasked with implementing basically the first wave of New York's retail cannabis ecosystem. They were tasked with finding, securing, and leasing out retail storefronts, dispensaries, to social equity licensees under what the governor and others now call the CARD program. CARD is CAURD. It stands for Conditional Adult Use Retail Dispensary. It is the first wave of dispensaries that are allocated specifically for people who were really impacted by the war on drugs. So to get a card license, you had to check two boxes. One was you had to have been negatively impacted by the war on drugs in a certain way, or have a close family member or someone who was, and you had to have run a profitable business for 2 years. If you check those two boxes, you applied, and you were lucky enough to get a card license, then you were handed this license that said you can, be the first to operate a dispensary in New York State. DASNY was responsible for basically getting those dispensaries. It ends up becoming a really complicated web of like who's responsible for what, and then you start to see the effects kind of trickle down, as I'm sure we'll get to a little bit later, of like what happens when all these different people have a hand, or have a piece of the pie and have an incentive to make money. And basic government bureaucracy, like, here's the formula for disaster, which is kind of what happened.
And why do you say that, Brad? The formula for disaster? Because it seemed like when we spoke on the phone that maybe there was a bit of a conflict of interest between the DASNY and the card programs in terms of people trying to find locations to operate their businesses. And I assume you know more about that than me, but I assume in New York City, finding, real estate is a hotly contested market that might cost you a pretty penny.
Yeah. So here's what's happening, and I can talk a little bit more about it now that it kind of came out yesterday a little bit during the hearing. So DASNY responsible for finding all these locations around the state, but a lot in New York City. They want to see their flagship stores open in New York City. They are finding and negotiating these store leases that are absurdly huge. Like you're talking about retail dispensaries that are like 8,000 square feet. And these are people who maybe have been selling weed for decades. And what do they need? They need like 200 square feet. They just need a storefront window. Like, they don't care. They don't need an Apple store. And they've been saying this since the beginning. But along with that 8,000 square feet, whatever, comes exorbitant costs that these people are going to have to pay back, including like up to 1.5 to higher $1 million that they need to then take out a loan through DASNY, pay 13% interest rate, and pay them back over 10 years. Once you start getting into the details of these loans and you start seeing what DASNY's charging these people and what they're charging them for, it's insane. It's ridiculous. And yesterday you heard it on the record in front of senators with people saying it is, quote, predatory. What DASNY is doing is predatory practices. They are trying to make money. They're hanging these people out, and they're saying, if you don't go with us, if you don't go with this loan, you can't open. You don't have a dispensary. You're screwed. So these are people, again, like, not a lot of these people are, I'm not going to blanket all of them, but like, not a lot of them are super business savvy and have the money to hire a lawyer and a consultant and an accountant and look at all this stuff and make a good decision. They're thinking, this is the government who promised us an industry. Of course, it makes sense. I'll do what they say. And they are going to be ruined. I mean, these people, like, with the illicit market, what's going on, the competition, like you heard it yesterday in spades, that there's not a lot of money to be made right now.
I did not hear it yesterday. Would you mind telling us about what happened yesterday? I know Lou mentioned this earlier, and I don't know if you watched those meetings, Lou. But a couple of people hit me up this morning to tell me about these meetings, including Rosalind Adams, who said she attended the hearings. And yeah, Rosalind, if you're watching, it's been nice to meet you as well.
Yeah, the meetings, it was the first ever time that the Senate got involved with this rollout and what's going wrong. Senator Jeremy Cooney organized earlier this year. It's a Senate subcommittee on cannabis, and he scheduled this hearing for yesterday and basically called every single stakeholder to the table to testify before this committee, a bipartisan committee, Democrats and Republicans, to question everybody about this rollout. So they had representatives from the OCM, they had representatives from DASNY, they had farmers, they had growers, they had the New York City sheriff, they had council members, they had like basically a cross section of everybody to get on the record what is going on. And it was real boring the first half of the day, because the first half of the day was just people from government just saying the same thing you knew they were going to say, and not blaming anything or anybody or taking any blame. But then they broke for lunch, and when they came back, it was like real people talking after that, and that was really fun to watch and illuminating, where they just told these senators basically everything we've known about. But I don't think these senators, most of them, had any idea what was going on, and they were shocked to hear this stuff about DASNY and the loans. And so it was worth watching. We published think 7 stories yesterday about this. If anyone needs to catch up, but we have a whole rundown of the important panels and what happened. But it was a monumental day where things were finally said on the record and under oath.
Yeah, and I got to just slap this back up. I'm with Brad Racino, New York Cannabis Insider, and Lou Rinaldi in the background, observing carefully with some great comments. And Lou, I want to thank you for being here, man. You've really been one of the most solid sources of information that I've met in the last 2 years. So thank you for that, man.
Thank you kindly. I think there's a shortage, as we've already hit on. There's a shortage of folks who are, objectively reporting on the maybe not as glamorous stuff, or the stuff that isn't completely rah. And it's just as vital. It's just as crucial information. The hearing yesterday in New York, my hope is to see that template be replicated in other emerging markets, including Connecticut, because I'm in complete agreement with you, Brad. I feel like the state legislators here, they only know what is passed to them in memo form for a lot of this stuff. And they're being told, oh yeah, social equity is great. Everything's going according to plan. Everything's working out. We're going to be pulling in that revenue. And, the golden goose is here to stay. And, the on-ground realities are so different. And it's unfortunate that it takes something like a hearing of this scope and scale to be able to get this information in front of them and to get it to be taken seriously. But at this point, it's sort of an any means necessary. Like you mentioned in your coverage, a lot of these folks are hanging on by a thread. A lot of these folks are not going to survive. They have ruined their lives for this. They have taken everything they had and put it on the line. And their representatives and all their elected officials need to hear it. They need to hear these things. They need to know that this is not isolated incidents or, one-off anecdotes, that this is a systemic problem and that we're not currently solving for root cause in any of these markets. So it's good to see that it finally did happen. And I guess I did have a question for you. There's one particular voice in New York cannabis who has sort of a 2-word slogan over the last, several months. And I see the signs all the time: codify card. So when someone says that, what exactly do they mean? Is it not actually part of statute at this point? Is it something that the legislature would need to act upon? I assume so, based on the word codify, but I was hoping you could shed a little bit of light on that for us.
Yep. So when CARD came out, the conditional adult use retail dispensary, it was part of a 3-pronged approach that Governor Hochul announced called the Seeding Opportunity Initiative. That was kind of getting the whole system set up by having licensed growers, processors, and then dispensaries. What they did, the New York State Legislature did, was they went through and created the adult use conditional cultivator and conditional processor license type in the law. Like it's a law that the governor signed, legislature signed off on, created it, the governor signed it. The dispensary part of it, though, did not go through the legislature. That was something that the Office of Cannabis Management kind of came up with on their own, and then instituted it, created these and handed out these licenses. But in doing it that way, they left themselves open to legal challenge. And as soon as they came out with this, the CARD program last year, we published story after story from different experts across the spectrum, calling this a mile away, saying this is going to result in a lawsuit. This flagrantly breaks the MRTA, the cannabis law in New York, because the cannabis law in New York says all dispensary licenses, the application for all dispensary licenses should be open to everyone at the same time. So you cannot do an end run around a law that was created and signed off by the governor and create your own little license type. And so they were sued over this by a company called Verisight last year, but it didn't go very far because the OCM just settled and just gave Verisight a license and they went away. But then a group of service-disabled veterans who had been complaining about lack of representation for many, many months, both publicly and to me, finally had enough, and they sued several months ago, challenging the constitutionality of the CARD program. And that is what has resulted in an injunction that is basically shut down the entire retail system in New York from proceeding. They're only the stores that are currently open are open, If a judge decides to exempt other retailers on a case-by-case basis, he can, but it's not looking like he's gonna. And it's looking like the state is gonna lose this lawsuit. And so the question of what happens to card is up in the air, and what that means if it's found unconstitutional, then what does it do to the businesses that are already open under card? Are they operating illegally? What happens to their loans? What happens to their, like, all of that is what is up in the air. So codified card is basically the call for legislators to go back to the drawing board and just put this thing into law, take it from regulations and treat it just like they did with the growers and the processor license and make it legal. Now, I also don't know if that's going to solve the problem. There's far smarter minds than me, including like every attorney in the world, who could probably answer that better. Of like, if you change something after the fact, does that nullify? I don't know. But that's what codified card means, is get it through the legislature and get it into law.
Thank you. That's exactly the answer I was hoping to hear. A little bit of clarity there. Hopefully that helps other folks who've been wondering about what that means too.
So many acronyms, man. It's insane.
And is this the veterans group involved in this lawsuit? Because that's another question on my list here. And that was something I was certainly interested in, because it seemed like maybe the veterans got screwed in New York. And I was curious to hear your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, so the veterans are one of the 5 classes of social equity defined under social equity in the MRTA and the cannabis law. Do you know the other? Yeah, do you know the other 5? And would you mind telling us a little bit about the social equity? Sorry to cut you off there, but yeah, that would be important, I think. Yeah, so it's service disabled veterans. It's women and minority owned businesses. It is people who come from a certain geographic area in New York State that hit certain metrics when it comes to like demographics and poverty and crime. Like, it's a whole other thing. And then I think there's, oh man, I'm forgetting. I think another one is just women-owned businesses. I could be wrong, and I'm forgetting the 5th one. But service disabled veterans were one of the 5. But they've been complaining for a long time of, hey, we have no representation on the Cannabis Control Board. We have no like liaison within the Office of Cannabis Management. We have no seat on the Cannabis Advisory Board, which is a big advisory board meant to inform and help and oversee some of the cannabis tax funds that come in. Basically, they're saying like, no one's giving us the time of day, even though we're a protected class under this law. And they've been publishing opinions in New York Cannabis Insider and speaking out. And then they kind of fractured, because this guy who's leading this lawsuit, Carmine Fiore, he's a service disabled vet in Long Island. I've met Carmine, smart guy. But he was growing increasingly agitated, and him and a small group of others finally said, screw this. And they sued the OCM and the state over the card program. But then quickly thereafter, they were joined by the medical operators in New York State. And that's when things got like conspiracy theory up the wazoo, of like, this is entirely funded by the medical operators. This is them coming from out of state trying to take over New York. And it's like, maybe there's truth to that, but like, I can tell you for a fact, Carmine's been talking this talk for like 6 months before this. Like, he was gonna sue. So I don't know. I mean, that's like a whole road I just stay away from, because I don't have the proof. I'm not going to say anything about that. But like, they got lumped in with MSOs and registered organizations in New York State, and that really muddied the waters of like how people feel about this lawsuit. I think it would have been very different if it just stayed veterans, but now that medical's involved, people fucking hate everybody when it comes to medical.
I don't think a lot of folks know when you refer to the medical providers. There's the situation in New York is that the MSOs who serve the medical market, now keep me honest here, Brad, the MSOs that serve the medical market are trying to get access to adult use, and maybe that has changed recently. Maybe they did in some way get access. I'm hoping you can shed some light on that. But they have been saying that, it's pretty ironic, because in other markets where they control both, medical and adult use, they don't seem to care about, competition and, opening up the market. But in New York, where they don't, or did not at least currently have access to the adult use market, they were clamoring for, we need to get in here. We need to be able to serve patients, blah, blah, blah. So they were boxed out for a while. And then I remember hearing recently that might have changed. So maybe you could speak on that for a minute.
Yeah, they were expected to stay out of the adult use side of things for a while. Like the card programs, social equity, everything was supposed to have a running head start ahead of the medical providers. And then what really happened is New York realized, like the OCM and other regulators realized that they needed, I think, MSO, either their stores, or they needed their money because they have no funding for anything. So in New York, these medical operators are allowed only 4 retail stores each, and there was up until recently only 10. So that's like 40 stores across the entire state of New York. I think there was only 38 in operation. A couple aren't even open. We just added an 11th medical, but they're not even up and running. I don't know what they're doing. So there's really effectively 10. They've wanted in. I think the state finally said, okay, as long as you pay a $20 million fee, you can get into the adult use side of the market. So that money, the 20 million from each of them,
20 million, 20 million, Brad.
Yep. Yeah, 20 million.
So
that money is supposed to go fund New York's like social equity programs and ventures. So like they're trying to justify the entrance of the ROs, or medical side, by saying this is going to allow us to fund what we've been trying to fund and haven't been able to get money for. And also there's all these like requirements, like these medical providers, when they open these stores, they need to reserve half their shelf space for like social equity brands. So it can't just be them carrying all their own stuff. They need to provide a market for the other half of New York. And at the end of the day, like even with 44 of them open, if all of them open 4 stores like immediately, they're talking about granting like 1,500 retail licenses in New York State. So I try and see both sides here. Of like, people hate the MSOs, but honestly, like 44 stores out of 1,500 is not going to decimate the market. But the other side of things is their grow operations. That's a whole other thing. Like they're allowed to vertically integrate. They're allowed to go from growing all the way to selling. Whereas the New York retail market, like all that side of things, people are not allowed to do both things. They need to pick a lane and choose it, but medicals can stay.
Brad, could you tell us about the licensing in New York, the tiers of it? I know in Vermont we have licensed tiers for different scales of outdoor and indoor growing, but maybe you could tell us about the different license types in New York?
I can tell you a little bit. I don't know, like when you're breaking down the tiers of each one, I haven't memorized that, but it's all online. But you're going to have, like I said, we have growers, processors, and retailers now. Those are all conditional. Now the general licensing is open. It opened earlier this month and will run through mid-December. Those licenses are open for a variety of different things. So you got like regular general growers, processors, retailers, micro businesses, which is a really interesting side of things. They are allowed to vertically.
Could you define what a micro business is in New York?
There are limitations on like how much they can grow, how like their retail footprint. I don't know off the top of my head all the other.
That's okay. That's all right. I'm not going to hold your feet to the fire, Brad. But
I hate when I don't know something, man.
That's okay. Yeah, we'll work on it. Yeah. I'm learning a lot too. And yeah, once again, here, let me slap this up. Brad Racino, New York Cannabis Insider. I'm supposed to do that every 15 minutes or so. Yeah, we're all learning together. Yeah, please don't. But the social equity was something that really caught my attention, because in Vermont I would qualify for social equity, right? Because my dad was arrested by the FBI when I was 7, and for smuggling hash from Canada, so I would qualify for that. But the cost of actually starting a business, maybe they waive the licensing fees and the application fees, but they don't waive the fees of like finding a location to do a grow at, or having the property, or the taxes for having the property, or anything like that. And I imagine in New York it's even crazier, because where do you grow weed in New York City?
You don't. I mean, maybe rooftops or something, but that's what's interesting about New York State, is like the ecosystem of the cannabis industry is upstate is all like, it seems to be a lot more. That's the grow, that's the processing, that's a lot of land for relatively cheap. And New York is the retail side of things, I think what'll eventually be a lot of consumption lounges, ton of delivery down there. Like that, it's kind of divided in the state, which makes sense. But up here is where a lot of the growers are: central, western, upstate New York, and their farms. But it's not like they have huge operations because they're not allowed to grow a lot. These conditional growers were severely limited for what they were allowed to grow. They have to be outdoors or like mixed lighting under a greenhouse, a small amount. So they grew 2 years ago under the promise that there would be a fully functioning retail system set up for them. Didn't happen. And then they just grew again. I mean, this is Croptober where they're harvesting, and still they're in the same position they were last year. They're sitting on old weed. Now they just grew new weed, and there's still not like a light at the end of the tunnel for them when it comes to where are they going to sell this? Like, who are they going to sell it to? Because there's no retail anywhere open. So it's bad for a lot of these farmers. It's really bad.
The light at the end of the tunnel is making hash, I think.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw that out there. Flash frozen. I see a lot of guys doing that this year in Vermont. And we've had a really rough growing season here, featuring a lot of septoria, just because of the record amount of rain that we've gotten. And, a lot of farmers just dealing with that. And, and I've really been curious about this. I'm like, in New York City, where are all the people growing weed? It's got to be very expensive to try to grow weed in New York City.
Yeah, outdoors. I mean, legally, yeah, I'm sure there's, New York City has had its own market for decades and decades, and they're growing indoor, and they're doing just fine. So that'll always be there. But when it comes to the legal market, yeah, I don't know where. Maybe not even Long Island, because Long Island hates weed. All those people, like all those politicians, hate weed. I don't know where they're growing there either.
I had a question for you, Brad. I'm curious to get your thoughts on some of the trade associations that are in play in New York, particularly groups like Canny and New York Small Pharma, and how would you, as a journalist, what's your perspective on these groups? How would you define them, and how would you characterize sort of how they dovetail into the greater scheme of things here?
That's a good question. So Canny was the first that like my first week on the job, they were the first ones I had heard of, because back then they were the New York Cannabis Growers and Processors Association. They were the only industry trade group in New York at the time that had any say whatsoever in anything. They grew pretty damn fast. I think they're now probably, I want to guess, like 400 or 500 members, and they have a seat at the table because their president of Canny is the one who's on every single retail store shelf now under Florist Farms, his brand. And then he's also a member of the Cannabis Advisory Board, advising the state regulators on what to do. So they are the most powerful group. I mean, they actually have a lobbyist. Their new executive director is the mayor of Homer up here, a little town up in upstate New York. Really cool guy. I like that guy. His name is Hal McCabe. But they're a powerhouse. They've grown very fast. There's a lot of hatred of this group from people who are not seeing the benefit of being a part of it, or believe that it's a tool for some people at the top of it to use to better themselves and not others. And a lot of that kind of animosity has led to these splinter groups. So now you have New York Small Farmers. I don't know them that well. I've talked to a couple of them, Jess and Erlikia, and then yesterday Joe Calderone was one of the panelists that testified before the Senate. They are just like, I think they were born out of animosity toward Canny, and they're just about farmers. They're not about the rest of the supply chain. And then who else do you have? And then you have the Card Coalition, which has just rebranded. Everyone's changing their names. It's like infuriating. Card Coalition is now like the New York Cannabis Retail Association. And that is like that's the retail side of things. So it's not the growers, the processors. That is specifically about all these card license holders, how they're going to get by, sharing resources, trying to like network and help each other. And that's a whole other thing. I don't know if I'm missing anybody. Oh, then there's a new processors association that again was born out of a frustration with, I think, with Canny, and they represent only the processors in New York State. They're pretty new-ish, but they're growing as well. I think that's all.
I got one for you, Brad. Could you tell us about the Freedom of Information Coalition? That was something I think you mentioned.
No, that's somewhere I used to work in Missouri when I was in grad school.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I thought, I was thinking about FOIA requests because I know Lou has done some nice FOIA requests in Connecticut to expose some things with the labs going on down there. And I had this note here that just said Freedom of Information Coalition, and I clearly fucked up the timeline on that one. Yeah.
I mean, I'll give them a shout out. They're a dope organization, man.
But that's actually I think there's a good question in there to pivot to, which is challenges that you and Sean have faced in terms of access. I know you mentioned right at the top that, you had one initial meeting with some folks and then they didn't want to know you after that. I guess from a purely journalistic perspective, what are the biggest challenges that you find yourself facing? And, what are your thoughts on how to address and how to overcome some of those challenges?
Also a great question. I think there's two main ones. One of them is access to information. Like there's usually two ways, three ways, main ones. There's going in through the front door, like, talking to an agency spokesperson saying, I want an interview with this person. I want you to provide me with this information, whatever. That's normal. Then there is the Freedom of Information law here in New York State, which you submit, a request. These government agencies are beholden to answer your request and most likely provide you documents or information. But that has not worked out in New York State with me. It's been damn near impossible to get information through FOIL requests from either the Office of Cannabis Management, Governor's Office, or specifically DASNY. I got so frustrated last year that I published a story every single day, counting up the number of days they wouldn't respond to my FOIL request.
That was awesome.
One of my favorite things. I was so annoyed. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot I have the power to do that as a publisher, so I'm going to do that now.
How many days was it? How many days was it, Brad?
I think, they finally provided the documents on day 100, but I think we started publishing on like day 78 or something like that. So I was publishing every day for 3 days.
3.5 months, something like that.
Oh, yeah, for something very simple. So that's been really tough, is that I know that there's information that these agencies keep that will be beneficial, not looking for dirt, not looking for like to get people in trouble. I mean, sometimes there is dirt that I'm trying to get, but like other times it's just useful information that we as journalists could take, analyze, clean up, and present to the public so they can make informed decisions. And like when we don't even get that drives me crazy. Mm-hmm. And the only option there is getting an attorney and suing. And yeah, we can do that, but like when you do that, I've been involved in that before. You got to pick your battles. And so far, when I've hit those walls, I go to that third option that I was mentioning, which is I just get somebody to leak me this stuff. I just find someone who has it and just get them to turn it over. It's not easy, but most of the time it works. So that's like the government agency side. But then the other big challenge has been getting people to talk honestly, who are in this industry, getting them to talk about their troubles or who they blame or their experiences, because they're so scared of the regulators in New York, whether it's the OCM or DASNY. No one wants to say anything negative because they're worried that they're not going to get a license, or they're worried that they're not going to get a loan, or like, and their fears are justified.
Those are fair worries, in my opinion.
All these people have been threatened. I mean, like, I know that they have been threatened by certain people within regulatory bodies for saying something. DASNY has these people sign NDAs, like when they look at their loan terms. This is a government agency, like asking the most vulnerable people right now to take out $1 million loans. But hey, sign an NDA. Don't talk to anybody about this.
And sign NDAs. Yeah, that's, boy, wow.
It's a mess. It's a mess, man.
You said this was, I think I have a quote from here somewhere that says this is like maybe the biggest shit show you've ever seen in any industry that you've ever covered.
Yep.
Is that accurate?
Yeah. The only other kind of similarity was like when I covered the VA out in California, they were the same when it came to obfuscation and not letting information out, all that stuff. And the same with sources who were scared to say something about the VA because they'd be denied their medical coverage or like whatever. That was similar, but and probably nationally it is actually worse and bigger. But like on a micro or local scale, this is the biggest clusterfuck I've ever seen covering anything.
Do you have a mechanism like an intake valve for whistleblowers or something who can just come to you and, without fear of reprisal and presumably, securely, anonymously hand you this kind of information?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on. It's always a case by case basis. I mean, I'm on Signal. I'm on WhatsApp. I think I have a Proton Mail account, but I haven't checked it. I should probably check that. But a lot of times it'll be like, what are they comfortable with? Is it something literally through the mail? Is it meeting in person? Is it going through a second person that they know to get me something? I just start from the default of, if you're willing to give me something, I'm willing to bend over backwards to make you comfortable and make you feel safe, and check those boxes, like to triple check actually that I do no harm in the process of you coming to me.
That's fantastic.
Can I ask you a question, Brett? As an upcoming journalist, I'm really very new at this. And one thing that's very important to me is protecting my sources. And I don't have any formal training in this, but could you tell us maybe some of the routes that you go through to anonymize your sources or to keep the people that are feeding you information safe?
Yeah. So, I mean, besides the basics of not naming them in print, it always starts out with a conversation of, a lot of times these people don't even know what it means to talk to a journalist. So I always start out with like, okay, let me just do a quick 101 with you of, here's what on the record means. Here's what off the record means. Here's what on background means, because nobody knows that. Like, I guarantee if you go out and ask 99% of people, they cannot tell you what on background means, because it changes. It's different in every conversation between every journalist and a source. It's up to the source to kind of determine what that means. Off the record, also, people don't know what that means. Off the record means that conversation never happened. Not only like it happened between, say, you and me, Caleb, but I can't go tell my editor about that unless you're okay with it. I can't act on the information you gave me in that conversation. If you said off the record, I know there's a document down at the library that you can get, I can't go get that document because you said off the record, because that doesn't, like, this conversation is non-actionable. Then you kind of transition over to background. That's where you have that conversation of, what can I do with your info? On the record means exactly what you think it means. It's your name is there. But when it comes to like other things to protect sources, I mean, you want to set up secure messaging like WhatsApp and Signal. You want to make sure that it's deleting every whatever you're comfortable with, every hour, every day. You want to make sure these people, especially if they're in government, they are not sending you emails from their government email address. That is very easily found. Even if they delete it right after they send it, there are backup mechanisms with a lot of agencies that'll catalog and keep all this stuff. So you need to kind of walk them through the basic, here's how you stay safe. Like, forget about me. I need you to stay safe. Here's how you do it. And usually the easiest thing is just meeting in person, and meeting somewhere that's not near their work and not where you're going to be seen with them. So those are kind of the main things. And just understanding like how things are cataloged and recorded, and avoiding those situations where they could be found, especially if they're found in discovery. Lawyers have a lot of power to find things if a lawsuit is brought. So they can go through your phone records and see a phone number from 6 months ago that you called and trace that back to that person. Like, there's a lot of that stuff that you don't even think about. So you kind of have to dream bigger when it comes to, how can I actually screw over this person, and then don't do that thing.
Good. Can I ask you a couple of questions, Brad? I got a couple of questions here in the comments. Does New York require proof that you live in New York? That's from Paul's Patio. Thanks for watching. Paul's always watching all my interviews. Thanks, Paul.
Does it require proof that you live for a license, you mean?
Yeah, some kind of residency requirement. I know that a lot of states have that. I don't know how that works in New York.
Not really. That's kind of what led to the first lawsuit, was the Vera site lawsuit in New York State. And just to skip forward, basically no, because there is one of the people who was granted a card license is an attorney in Boston. So he lives in Boston. He has a license here in New York. So there's a thing called the U.S. Dormant Commerce Clause, which is like a federal clause that prohibits discrimination based on where you live by residency. You can't like discriminate against commerce, against interstate commerce. So they have to have a significant presence in New York, but what that presence means is different than you have to live here.
Okay. And I got one more from Jane Lane. Are there other industries in New York that have people sign NDAs to participate in government programs?
That's a great question. Not that I know of. I could be wrong. I don't know, but I've never heard of it in California, Missouri, or New York, anywhere I've ever reported.
Thank you, Jane. I appreciate that. One of the, I'm trying to keep this tight here, but I want to ask you about some of the lab testing in New York and how that's going, because one of the major premises of this industry was that the lab testing was going to make it a safe and tested product. And I'm not sure if we touched on all the unlicensed stores yet, but I feel like maybe that ties in, and maybe we could do that one to wrap it up here, because I see Paula talking about this a lot, these unlicensed stores, and it seems like there's a lot of them in New York.
Yeah, there are thousands and thousands of unlicensed stores. I think just in New York City alone, it is the number one problem right now in the entire cannabis ecosystem in New York State. But aside from that, these stores are obviously not regulated. They can carry whatever they want. A lot of them are bringing in brands from out of state, from other states that are bleeding and hemorrhaging, like California and others. So you're seeing a lot of California products on New York shelves. However, you don't know if that actually is the legitimate California product or if it's just a counterfeit. There are entire industries set up around counterfeiting bags and counterfeiting packaging, and so you don't know what's in those things. And some of them have a QR code that you could scan and might bring you back to the website of the company. Others have nothing. I've been in these stores, I've seen them, there's nothing, or they'll just sell you a Ziploc bag of weed. And you don't know what it is or what's in it. And most people are willing to take that risk. So that's just completely untested. New York's pitch for New Yorkers is, we want you to buy legal because our products are safe and tested. And also the tax money from it is going to go back into communities that are going to be, positively affected. They're having a hard time with that because the price difference is so insane. They're like double or triple the price in legal stores compared to what you see when you walk into a bodega in New York City. Now, are people willing to spend that much more for the guarantee of a safe and tested product? I don't know. Like, we'll see when this actually plays out and you have more data. There's only 21 stores open right now, but it's a big bet that people who have been smoking weed their whole life, that has never been tested with a QR code on it, and they've never worried about their nickel counts or their whatever, like now they all of a sudden care enough to spend that much more. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be the case.
And there's also the unanswered question of the validity of the testing and the integrity of the testing. The moving of goalposts in order to satisfy, changing market conditions. There's a lot going on with lab fraud and THC inflation. And I don't know how much of that has manifested in New York. The only thing I know in New York was the change that was made in order to make a previous year's harvest viable, to loosen the restrictions in order to get that product to market. But I don't know if that's something you have some more insight into.
Yeah, I'll just be real quick because I know we're short on time. So last year, I think it was December, I did a test. I went down to New York City. I bought 10 of the top selling strains from one of the dispensaries that was open at the time and had them independently tested for THC content. Came back and it was exactly what you thought. They were wildly inflated numbers. And the reason wasn't lab shopping, though. The reason was New York had created this regulatory allowance where these growers could sell their weed on store shelves, and the THC percentage was not what the bud was. It was what the seed averages. And so it was called line testing, and it allowed farmers to get their products through the testing industry really fast to get them on shelves because they needed stuff on shelves. So you're looking at, like, here's a thing that says 28% THC and it tests at 12%. It's like, yeah, like the grower probably didn't know what they were doing. They're growing outdoor. This is a seed that's native to, say, California, grown indoor. Like, yeah, you're going to see that. So we did that story, and within 24 hours, the state completely changed their rules and regulations and shut that down and made people independently actually test the THC product. So I went back a couple months ago, repeated the same test and opened up a whole other can of worms when it came to the lab side of things and their accountability, and the fact that they were just flagrantly breaking the rules when it came to like reporting pesticides and other things that they needed to report. They just weren't reporting them, or they were egregiously wrong in their certificates of analysis. And then the other thing we found was like some of these products, the top selling products in New York State, are just loaded with mold, like loaded with mold and bacteria. And I caught a lot of shit for that from a lot of farmers and from the OCM saying like, there's good bacteria and there's bad bacteria. And I'm like, yeah, but if this is an account that's 100 times what's allowable under the medical program, like where's your line? Like what will you not smoke? And like people wouldn't answer that. And it's like, okay, so there is a line, like where is it? Can we talk about it? And no one wanted to talk about it.
You're asking the right questions though. And
well,
we appreciate
it also brings up the question of who's drawing the line of what's acceptable for medical programs. Because in our state, it wasn't doctors. It was the legislature who got to come up with the allowable conditions to get a medical card. And they're not qualified to make those types of medical decisions, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a gray area, and everyone wants it to be black or white. And it's like, can we just have an adult conversation about this? And no, you can't. So yeah, to your point, like these limits are based on maybe what other states have done. New York's looking at other states, saying we're going to model it after this or that, but no one asked the question why. Like, why did they base it on that? What evidence do you have? What is allowable? Like that conversation, it just gets lost in the you're right, you're wrong kind of two-sided thing.
And are those other states also totally fucking this up? And should we be copying them?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And shameless slap here. Brad Racino, New York Cannabis Insider. I'm getting down to the end of this. I know it's Halloween and you're going to do some trick-or-treating, Brad. It's been a real pleasure to have you on here. I've got I'd like to throw a couple names at you and just get your reaction. These are some people I'd like to get on this show here. Maybe Paula Collins.
Paula is one of our frequent guest columnists. She is a very smart woman who lends a very unique voice when it comes to her push for transitional licenses for the unlicensed problem in New York State. She's the only one that's really come up with any kind of even potential solution for how to address this overwhelming problem in New York State. She's very divisive. A lot of people don't like when she talks about this stuff, especially like the MSO gang and all those, but Paula is fantastic. I've had her as a panelist several times at our conferences and events.
David Fetter.
David's great. My reporter Sean talks to David a lot more than I do, although I am talking to him right now about a different story. David's super active, super smart. Yeah, I think he would be a great get.
Jeff Hoffman.
Of course. Jeff Hoffman is the best, man. He does his Ask Me Anything every week live on LinkedIn. He's actually doing a live one for us at our conference in White Plains in 2.5 weeks. Yeah, Jeff is the greatest.
Plug the conference.
Yeah. November 16th, White Plains, full day. It's our last conference of the year. I put a lot of work into these things every time. We're gonna have, it's basically like an academic theme this time. I try and change up the theme at every conference, keep it new. And this one is like for brand new people getting into the industry because they just opened up general licensing, and then experts and the people who've been around a while. So we're having like I'm calling them classes, like 101 and 301 level classes on a bunch of different important topics like retail best practices, how to navigate insurance, how to do accounting, how to do like all these different things. And then we're going to have 3 full panel discussions on social equity, basically the promise of social equity in New York, on the people who lost the fight when it came to like prohibiting weed in New York State. Like, why do they still have a say? Why are they still influencing policy? That's going to be a really interesting one. And then we have retail, basically consumer focused panel about like, what are people buying? Why are they buying it? What are best practices for retailers? All of that. So it's going to be like a full thing. And then like every conference we do, we have lightning round business consultations for people for free from a bunch of different experts. We have networking, happy hour, lunch, unlimited coffee. It's a good day. These are really, really fun. I get a lot of really positive feedback about them. And I put a lot of work into them. So yeah, November 16th, White Plains at the Sonesta Hotel. I don't know if it's like a Hilton or something, from 9 to 5:30. Tickets are available online. If you just Google New York Cannabis Insider White Plains, you'll see it. And we do have some social equity sponsors as well, because I try and dedicate a bunch of tickets for free for people who can't afford to come. So if people are interested in that, they can kind of reach out to me. You can find me everywhere on Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever, and hit me up, and I'll see if we can allocate some tickets for you.
Right on.
Jeff Schultz. That's the last name I got on the list.
Schultz is super smart. He brings a different side of things. Like, he's much more the money side of like investors and how, like when Chicago Atlantic, which is the company that came in from Chicago to fund New York State's $150 million social equity fund, he was the first person I called to try and just understand, like, how does this work when you have like subsidiaries and LLCs and REITs, real estate investment trusts, and like all these things. How does this, explain this to me like I'm 5. And Jeff is always kind of that first person I call to just break it down. Super, super smart dude.
And that was supposed to be, if I'm not mistaken, Chris Webber and Al Harrington, maybe, that were supposed to fund that New York social equity program at the beginning.
Chris Webber, not Al Harrington. Chris Webber is still there. He's the fund manager that was picked by DASNY to raise the $150 million, which they did through Chicago Atlantic. That's a whole other thing. We could have another hour-long conversation.
Yeah, we're gonna follow up. I hope we can do this again sometime, Brad.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I love talking this stuff, and especially with people who get it and understand, the importance of this kind of reporting. It's my favorite thing to do, and I'm happy to be a guest whenever you want.
Dude, I'm going to wrap it up here, too. I also want to thank Lou for being here. Lou, thank you. I really thought you added some great questions here to the conversation, and you always do that, you smart son of a bitch. Yeah, thank you. And Brad, I always leave the last word for the guest. So if there's anything we missed or any shameless plugs or shout outs you want to add, it's Brad Racino, New York Cannabis Insider. And thank you one more time for joining me today, man. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I think I try to end things always the same, which is, if you are involved in this industry and you care enough to make a change, you want to see something change, make your voice heard, show up to meetings, write letters, pick up the phone, call your legislators, do something other than sit back and just kind of complain online. We and others are here to be your megaphone. And so use us, use others, but do something, get involved. Don't just sit there and complain.
Damn
Word up.
straight.
Yeah. It's Brad Racino, New York Cannabis Insider, Lou Rinaldi. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey. Remember, the devil's in the details, and the details are in the fine print.